Over to you. Artificial Intelligence, Worldviews and Dialogue.
Oh, I'm amazed to hear this almost actually written by you. I see that. Yeah. It's very frustrating as an academic because you keep discovering the secret of the universe and sending of books out that you think are going to change everything. And you don't hear any of this probably the first time I've heard about it. And it was published in January, so thank you for reading it. So I'm going to try. I learned this trick from Beth. Very complicated, isn't it? I spent some time trying to figure out how to get my iPhone to move I couldn't get it done, but your trick is better. It's more simple, isn't it? If I do both at once. In other words, I can see the screen and behind me. So let's synchronize. So now if I just press both at once, everything will be fine. I kind of was given this title, I think, by Dave, but I accepted it willingly. I think I was partly very keen to come here because, as he mentioned, I did have this religious education background. I trained at Bristol, a PGCE, back around about 1989. And I kept thinking I could do better. I'm going to improve this theory. And now I've been invited back finally to hopefully to put something in. I hope some people are interested in religious education because it is a passion of mine, really. But just to introduce myself briefly, I'm based in Faculty of Education at Cambridge, and I also founded at Hughes Hall the Digital Education Futures Initiative, where we're exploring new models of education that are made possible by new technology. So as you can imagine, now it's all about AI, and everyone's very interested in AI. But for me, it's also about dialogue. I'm also in the Cambridge Educational Dialogue Research Group. We've got a bit of a tradition at Cambridge with Robin Alexander, Neil Mercer, Christine Howe, and we've been there are lots of resources if you're interested. So both of those pages, if you can look them up later, you can subscribe at the bottom, and then you can get our newsletters. So that would be nice. So just introducing myself a bit more. And for me, the challenge of AI is in some ways something of an opportunity because although people have doubts about it, it does seem remarkably effective. And in constant evaluations, for example, with doctors diagnosing patients, they find the AI does much better than the doctors. Not only that, it has a better bedside manner. People like it more. And of course, with law, it's usually much better than etc. So it can pass all these exams rather better than most students. Admittedly, not all students yet, but this includes essay type exams. They did this little study at Reading, but it's happening all the time. There are endless studies showing that AI can pass the exams better than the average student, not necessarily as well as the best students, but I think that puts forward. But it's getting better all the time, right? So it's a very recent phenomenon, generative AI. And I think that raises a very interesting challenge for education. It's a genuine opportunity for us to rethink what we're doing. Because if it can do all these educational exams, then why are we assessing students like that? The answer tends to be, oh, well, let's force them to do things that the AI can't do so they can't cheat. Let's make sure that they're in face-to-face exams writing essays on bits of paper so the AI can't do it. But I think that's the wrong approach, because if you think about it, if the AI can do this stuff better than the students can, then why are we teaching the students it? Because in the future, the AI is going to do that kind of thing. And it's really interesting to find that all these exciting writing skills, I mean, I had a checkered schooling, but at one point, for a few years, I was at a good grammar school, and all we did every week was write lots of essays. I then went to university, and I studied philosophy, and I wrote essays. So now I'm really good at writing essays. I know exactly what it is, and students come to me from a range of backgrounds, from China and other countries, and they're clearly not doing it right. And it's not that they're not clever, or they just don't have that, what would you call it, that cultural capital, that background. And I can teach them how to do it, and now AI can teach them how to do it. But the fantasy that when we put in our little gradings, this is showing originality and critical synthesis, not really. It's a craft that we've learned in our particular cultural context, and we teach it to the kids. Real thinking, I would put to you, is something different. And so I'm going to argue about that here, and I'm going to see, can the AI in education actually restore something of deeper value. And let's see if that's possible. One of the things, an easy starting point, I don't know if you know Martin Robbins, I rather like his stuff. He's a drama teacher and he did the Trivium, but I just couldn't resist using the copy of his latest book, which is very nice. There's a lot of bits about dialogue. But he's got this nice image here of the woman, well, Athena, obviously, she's not really a woman, fighting this horrible monster, Athena versus the machine. And frequently you hear in England, and I think you still hear, the claim that we shouldn't worry too much about AI, because education is really about humans. Pedagogy is about people and relationships. And people like philosophers like Kurt Biester say that sort of thing, I'm pretty sure. But is it really true? Can we learn something from the history? Oh, by the way, I've got a whole hour, which is a luxury, but do interrupt or something if it gets boring or you want to challenge me. And of course, I don't actually have a very clear time. So perhaps, Dave, you could warn me maybe when I got, 10 minutes or something.
Yeah, that you some questions. So
Yeah, of course. Okay, but it's an hour and 15, right? Also, would you like me to talk 45 and leave half an hour for questions? That's a good idea. I can be flexible as long as people, let me know roughly if I'm rambling on too much. But let's go back. So the first recognizable schools were these, you probably know this from ancient Sumeria. Fascinating topic, though, because it's so reminiscent, certainly not so much of all of our schooling, perhaps, although maybe, but Winston Churchill's schools sound very similar. They used to get beaten if they got their handwriting wrong because they had to write as an exercise, my day, these scribes, a small minority of ancient Sumerians about 5,000 years ago, writing in clay. It sounded remarkably similar to many schools in the last century or so, where you start off with the handwriting and you move up to some basic contracts and things, and you end up with myths and stories, and you all sit in a row, and there's a master of the whip who it's like the deputy headmaster, I suppose. Anyway, so my point of showing that was to show that the idea that education is nothing to do with technology is perhaps a bit naive, because why did they have schools? Because this is the argument, and I've looked into it a bit, when you gather together in large numbers, you find there's a bit of a need for contracts and for a memory, and so you develop a technology to support that, which involves writing, cuneiform. Then you need operators of this new technology, so you have to create schools to train them up. And so what we have inherited, this schooling, which often is about the 3 R's, isn't it? Writing, reading, and arithmetic, is there for a technology. Writing is a technology. It's not some natural form. So possibly when people are saying we should ignore the technology and not just leap at it, they might just be saying we should stick with 17th century technology rather than move on. But of course, writing isn't all that's involved in education. Oral societies before written societies emerged, and also around written societies and everywhere today, also have education. And while a lot of that is about participating in communities of practice or just observing and pitching in, as Barbara Rogoff puts it, there's usually also a more formal induction into the myths of the tribe. And apparently, and I know this is a little bit from your anthropologists and archaeologists here, I know it can be, you see, it's certainly speculative, but it's had quite an influence, this argument from David Lewis Williams, the first professor of cognitive neuroarchaeology or something in South Africa. But they had quite a lot of written ethnography about the San Bushman's use of caves. And these caves, some of them were as old as caves in Europe and around the world. I think it's about 40,000 BC. But then they had people who'd actually been using them, and they could realize, well, it wasn't, as some people had thought, a sympathetic magic where you draw an eland so that you can hunt more elands. The eland was like a powerful spirit, like a trickster spirit. And it was painted in a full moon in hematite and blood. I just put that in to say it's not just a picture. It comes alive. It means something. And when you have trance dancing, which possibly involves a little short, shallow breathing, loss of oxygen, apparently the walls of the caves for many of the San came alive. They could move through into their culture, and they would use these drawings. You would touch them, and the energy would come in, and you'd induct people there. So in a way, it's the first education technology. And I rather like it because for me, it symbolizes the essential role of technology in education, which is if you are again, to move people. See if I've written that. Oh, give you another example first before I give you my take on it. What do you think the role of technology is? But I just thought I'd add another one. I studied social anthropology and philosophy originally, and I was fascinated by this sort of thing. You also see technology here, where in the Congo, within recent memory, you still they have initiation ceremonies different for boys and girls, but similar in type, where it involves putting on masks, and then you end up after the dances and the ceremonies, after lots of this is initial stage where you get kind of threatened and challenged, and you have a bit of an ordeal, so it means something to you. That's this classic with initiation ceremonies. You end up with these little ivory amulets. So in a way, you're using the technology to move you from being a private, separate individual, shall we say, a biological being, to being a cultural being. And the technology is required to shift your identity from that of an individual, a small group, to participating in this longer-term culture that exists in the cave, possibly for thousands of years. Does that make sense? Is that plausible? Without the technology of some sort, it's very hard to do that. And so there's a particular role there of technology in education, which we argued in this book, which is 24, is something that's kind of been ignored in education, the voice of technology. And one of the inspirations is Gilbert Simondon, who influenced Deleuze and Latour and Bernard Stiegler and others. He was a lover of technology. He used to have a little room with lots of gadgets and used to play with them. And he said, actually, it's not something that I brought out in this talk, but it's kind of interesting. When he did studies of, for instance, the development of the internal combustion engine, you could see how, okay, engineers have to be involved, but the engineers are involved by kind of loving the machine and understanding it, and then they take it forward. And so for him, the technology had a drive to a kind of internal coherence. So you brought in things that didn't really quite fit. First, they stuck on a fan, and then it was all integrated in the design. So I just think that's quite interesting. It's suggesting that the evolution of technology has its own drive, and we can see this happening all around us, but it's faster than the biological evolution. Biological evolution led to the development of language, so we seem to be hardwired to teach and learn language, but it doesn't mean it's not also a technology. We develop specialist technical terms. But when we want new things like arithmetic and literature, that's when you tend to get schools and you tend to be aware that you're doing education. But it is actually partly to catch up with the technology. So it's partly not how can we use technology as a supplement to education. It's partly how can we use education to help the technology. That's just a thought. I'll try and hopefully that can stimulate some challenging questions later. The question is then, why are we doing this sort of thing? When I first arrived at Cambridge, I had to put on a gown in May and walk up and down, make sure they weren't cheating. And it didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. Because in real life, anywhere you go, you do actually have access to the internet and other tools, and you tend to have to work in teams. And certainly you're probably going to have AI from now on, probably installed in your brain shortly. What is the point of this? Why is this an assessment? Where does it come from? And answering that again with a history, oops, I'm getting out of sync again. Through reading a bit about it, I came across this really interesting quote from Comenius, who after was a great visionary. And he was moving people from Latin to the vernacular languages. He was advocating education for all girls as well as boys, as a source for reason that would bring world peace. It was interesting. He was from, I can't remember the exact Bohemian group that's rather similar to the Quakers by the sound of it. He was very motivated. But nonetheless, of course, he built on the affordance of textbooks, which was still fairly recent. And he argued that through textbooks, we're actually doing something new, which is called didactography on the model of typography. We're typing knowledge onto the brains of students, and the ink is the teacher's voice. And that's why you have to assess regularly. At the end of the week, at the end of the year, you have to have all these exams. So you're taking the knowledge from the books, you're putting it into the brains, you're changing the brains, And obviously at the time, this seemed like a marvelous innovation. But I think now you can think, well, it's not really the latest thing now. Is this really what we're trying to do here? Is it all about print literacy? Because that seems to have disadvantages as well as advantages. I was lucky enough to invite Stanislas Dehaene to a conference we're holding in Exeter, this French neurophysiologist who's written a lot about the effects of reading, done some very nice studies. And as well as, of course, you could say many advantages of learning to read, and most of us, we're all presumably literate, and we all seem very keen on teaching children to read, and we will celebrate it. But, literacy rate's gone up in Kerala. Isn't that great? Well, yeah, maybe, but maybe some indigenous oral cultures have kind of disappeared because you actually think differently with literacy. And one of the ways you think differently, and he measured this, is shifting from holistic thinking to analytic thinking. What's fascinating about literacy is, as you pointed out, when you hear words now, your visual cortex lights up as well as your oral. And apparently quite a lot of the visual cortex is colonized by all the writing and reading. So, for example, you recognize fewer faces, being that's measurable. But at the same time, you can analyze. So when you're a lot of this comes from Walter Ong and Olson and other theorists, including Jack Goody at Cambridge a few years ago. But the point is that your thinking changes. So that if you're an oral person, if you're just speaking and listening in the community, you're always in the context. You're always in the relationship. You don't separate yourself out. It's very hard even to separate words out. But with writing, of course, you can pin things down and you can analyze it. And that's a great advance. And you can spread them around the world. And that's led to global science and enlightenment and all that colonialism that was mentioned earlier. And in many ways, it's done marvelous things. And of course, we want to spread literacy and get rid of all those oral cultures. Sorry, I'm exaggerating a little bit. But at the same time, maybe something's been lost. And this was pointed out by Socrates, who himself was an oral person. He didn't write anything down. Plato wrote down his dialogues for him, and we don't, of course, know if they were faithfully written down or not. But Plato, in the Phaedrus, describes him as saying that writing is not a very good idea. Basically, you can borrow a scroll from the library, you can read it out, and everyone thinks, oh, you're so intelligent. Then they ask you a question, and you can't answer it. I think he's got quite a good point there. That reminds me of a lot of the students I made who get A stars, but you ask them questions, they don't really know what they're doing. And he said that thinking isn't about writing. Writing is dead stuff. Thinking is the living word between people. When you need dialogue, you need a range of perspectives. It's about asking better questions, really. And the writing actually takes away from that. And this tends to lead to what Comenius was talking about, a kind of model of knowledge as if it's a representation. In Cambridge, you don't just study sociology, you're reading sociology, you're reading mathematics. The curriculum is a stack of books. And of course, first you've got to know how to read them. So there's this idea that knowledge could be a representation of the world. Whereas the alternative, which you get in more oral cultures, is more about relationship, not about representing reality, but about relating to it. This is a little nice study done by Kevin Martin, who did a PhD with me. And this is a traditional oral culture of farmers in Kenya, and they used to learn together like this, but now they're learning together with the addition of mobile phones, which they got some clever techniques, so they could even use them off the internet. So if a farmer introduces a new technique, they can do a little video of it, they can talk over it, they can upload it to a platform, they can teach other farmers in the region without any literacy needed at all. Of course, in reality, they do use a lot of literacy, but it's just interesting that the new technology can enable us to return to some of the affordances that have been lost of previous oral models of teaching and learning. Because I imagine this might be an RE audience. I thought I'd take this opportunity. This is new stuff. Some of the other stuff you might have seen at the ASE, but this is new. I put this in yesterday because I did a little study of this representation because I was always fascinated. And I hope the religious education people appreciate these materials, and you're certainly free to use them. I've also been struck by knowledge in the Bible. You have this phrase in English, which is a little bit euphemistic, knowledge in the biblical sense. This is also rather striking that it says in Genesis, Adam knew Eve and she conceived. What does that mean? Why say knowledge? So I looked into it, And I think it's plausible. It's, obviously it's a little bit speculative, but you can trace the origination of the Hebrew words. This is written like 1000 BC, wasn't it? Something like that. It's quite old. It was rooted in oral culture. And at that time, they were developing pictograms from various sources. And the early pictograms for the ayin and for dalet are eye and door. So to know isn't to represent something. I'll show you what it is. I managed to get ChatGPT to draw this picture for me. I think it illustrates the difference rather well. It's the idea of an eye. Knowledge is an eye passing through the door of a tent. So if you stand outside the tent, you can see it there in the distance and you can locate it and say, oh, that's a tent. Do you really know it? And say to know it, you have to go through the door. So knowledge isn't representation, it's relationship. So to know somebody isn't just to represent them, to say, oh, they're that height and they got that background. It's to actually kind of live their life a bit from the inside, through talking to them, through getting to know them, which is a very different kind of knowledge, isn't it? Oh, and of course that relates to, we heard Buber being mentioned earlier. I have to say I got all this from ChatGPT yesterday. It's rather a good summary though, isn't it? I have read my Buber and I have read my... but the idea is that, my experience, ChatGPT knows an awful lot, and it's very good at summaries. But obviously there are various different things you can use, and you can use different versions, and it's improving all the time. But the idea of Martin Buber is making this clear distinction between these orientations involved in knowledge, the objectifying knowledge, the external knowledge, versus the relational knowledge, just being in an actual dialogue with somebody. And this external I-it kind of knowledge has been emphasized by the print-based education system. It's not essential. This isn't like technological determinism, but it's just kind of what's happened, isn't it? Especially with the emphasis on STEM and so on. And you can also see it in the way that, this is actually, I got this from Stephen Toulmin, Cosmopolis, who pointed out, Stephen Toulmin, the philosopher, is famous for his arguments. But he pointed out that he noticed the shift in the way we talk about thinking, that even Erasmus and Montaigne, the humanist thinkers, were following the Greeks in thinking about thinking as a dialogue. But in a dialogue, you have different voices and you don't really know where it's going. And then at a certain point, with Descartes, with Spinoza, who always used to write in geometrico, and of course with Newton, Leibniz, and so on, we got a model of thinking as a formula that you apply. You're either right or wrong. You either do it right or you do it wrong. And I think that comes, certainly Spinoza's use of the geometrical thinking, from the status of Euclidean geometry. And after the Bible, this was the book that was most printed in the early printing presses. It was reproduced thousands of times. It was used up until almost quite recently, into the 19th century, as a sort of textbook for mathematics. And of course, with a book, you're standing above the page. It's all kind of framed in a little box. And you don't have the uncertainty. You don't have the multiplicity. You can think within the box and you can get it right. And this, of course, seems far more powerful as knowledge. And this is the basis of the kind of thinking that's dominated in mathematics and STEM and in the education system. I would suggest that the alternative, which you get, say, Paul mentioning in Corinthians, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. You also get this in Marxism and the philosophy of language. Volosinov, who worked with Bakhtin. Bakhtin is the philosopher behind a lot of our dialogic theory. The meaning is an electric spark. You need two different perspectives. It's not a formula. The thought is not a formula. And Heidegger says the same in What is Thinking. He says thinking isn't science. It's not mathematics. Thinking is actually the call of that which is most thought-provoking, which sounds, kind of ridiculous, but it's true, isn't it, really? We are prompted to think by something outside us. It's not just applying an algorithm. And so this, of course, affects religion quite a lot. So if you start off using the Sand-Bushman cave as a model of animism, they called it, didn't they? I'm not sure how true that is. I'm not an expert in theology or religion. I'm just an enthusiast. But everywhere you have religions around powerful places like caves and waterfalls and trees. They can't be moved. That seems to be the model, and you still get this to some extent continuing in Hinduism. And the religions of the book enable that magic and mystery to be carried around, to be transferred. I love this, this fantastic story of Xuanzang. We've got Mindu here, hopefully. I thought I'd put in a Chinese Buddhist reference as well. You've got Xuanzang, amazing story. It took actually 17 years, I think, to go to India. Why did he go to India to try and get the authentic Buddhist texts? Because he just felt unhappy. He thought it didn't fit, it didn't make sense. They had corrupt forms of Buddhism, and he wanted to purify it. I think that's interesting. And he came back with 600 new texts. And of course, they also had fantastic caves in Mogahambi. Now, but I'm trying to go later in Dunhuang, where, of course, you get the teachings of the Buddha on the walls. So it's a bit like the early caves, if we accept that educational purpose. But then we have these new caves, and of course, we see them all around us all the time. The same. Oh, sorry, got to press it here, haven't I? I was really amazed by Saint-Chapelle. It's got 1,300 little pictures. It's like a massive illuminated manga comic. So you can get almost all the stories in the Bible, and you don't need to read and write. You can just look at the pictures. It's very like a kind of cave, but this time full of light. And it's obviously transferred through the book, which enables the meaning to uproot from a particular place and go global. So I'm just suggesting that technology, our communications technology, very much also influences the forms that religion take, as well as the forms that education takes. The idea is that with books, I got this from Jack Goody. The unfortunate title of his book in Cambridge was The Domestication of the Savage Mind? But he was quoting Levi-Strauss, La Pensée Sauvage, anyway. But, I mean, he pointed out all these anthropologists going to different groups and finding their category structures were not realizing how their way of thinking was already informed on the inside by the technology of print. This is how we learn in schools. It's not how people actually think. And so books enabled religion to become mobile and spread, but they also had a negative side. For example, I read somewhere in the book of Revelations that this book is finished. Anyone who adds to this book will be horribly cursed. You get the idea of this closed meaning, so you can no longer participate. And you can't even read it because it's written in a foreign language like Latin or Greek or whatever. So you have these specialists. In other words, it imposes, if you think about it in relation to more animist religion in small-scale societies, it imposes a kind of hierarchy and this more abstract, universal, and often transcendent, as in the transcendent God view of meaning. And so the technology is not irrelevant to the meanings that we have. And of course, I thought I'd put in, although very nuanced and rather different perhaps with Buddhism, you get something similar. Manjushri, Bodhisattva of Wisdom, always has a book as well as a sword that cuts through the nonsense. You have a book of wisdom. And I didn't even recognize it's a book, so I thought I'd point it out to you. It's a kind of scroll on a lotus, but it's a book. And that does kind of make a difference. That's why Xuanzang wasn't happy with the local religion, because he wanted the authority. He wanted to go back to the source. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Now this is massive simplification of a very nuanced and complex story, but I think it's possible, I think it's plausible to say that it's something to do with this shift to print literacy in the West and the mass education that enabled a shift which hasn't really happened before. For most of the world, throughout most of history, inducting people into religion and education have worked together very closely. Indeed, even in Britain, with the mass literacy movements in the 19th century, they started mainly with Sunday schools. You learn to read and write by learning to read and write the Bible. And they often used to quote in Cambridge and Oxford the lines from Thomas Aquinas, was it that theology is the queen of the sciences? That we are learning about God and the cosmos at the same time as we're learning knowledge. These are not two different things. That split, which you might see as an alienation, came in only because of this interesting capacity to shape meaning through books as if separate from the holistic context of the myths and the history of the tribe with experimental science. And of course, this is complex, and there was always continuity, and people like Descartes, who were accused of being part of this, was a monk, and Newton developed his scientific method by exploring the Bible. I don't know if you knew that. It was kind of interesting. But nonetheless, the basic, I don't know if I was thinking I was going to try and summarize the argument. I've got it somewhere else here. Yeah, here we are. This is being controversial. I hope you don't mind. And I'm very looking forward to some challenges. But that maybe you're only allowed to speak in this culture if you have gone through the proper training. If you've basically learned how to think inside the box and not even to question the larger picture that's implied. I often wonder, people who reject religion or the significance of religion, as I was saying the other day, I wonder, where do they think they are? Because if you have a point in time or a point in space, bound up with that point in time is some sort of eternity, some sort of horizon, some sort of infinity. And that people can quite happily work within a little framework and think that's quite sufficient, as if they understand enough and they don't need to question any further, and therefore they don't think they need a religion or a worldview, is something that we kind of train in through education. And only when you've shown that you're good at that sort of thing, i.e. narrow tunnel vision, are you allowed to stand up on a stage and speak? You say, we don't need all that big picture meaning stuff. But if you go anywhere in England, I mean, when I was studying anthropology, we used to have plays like from Levi Brule and so on, that this was the idea of the savage mind. You have the logical Westerners who think like this, and then you have these irrational people who have all these wonderful magic-y kind of thinking. But in every town I've ever been in, there's been a spiritualist church. And most small villages and many people who haven't got PhDs believe in magic and have experiences and have dreams and so on. So maybe we are creating and shaping certain ways of thinking and then valuing these to the exclusion of the other. I'm sticking all that to be a little bit controversial there, following on. But obviously I'm not a religious expert, but I was very inspired by all the stuff from Mercier Eliade, which I think links to Paul Tillich, which is, what is religion? Now, I say in anthropology, you tend to be quite happily to attribute what any of the local people believes to their religion, but they don't always accept that. They just say, well, that's just reality, isn't it? I mean, witchcraft is real, right? And the god Quoth who breathes over the corn is real. And we're saying it's religion because from an ethic perspective, we don't like that sort of thing. So what is religion? Well, if we accept something like it's how we relate to the horizon of the unknown, which is what I actually gained from reading Mercier Eliade, although it's not quite what he said, science fits rather well, doesn't it? Because if you have a culture where we know there's a little bit of light of things we think we know, surrounded by this vast chaotic sea of all the unknown, how do you deal with that? You need some procedures. Do you have rituals? Do you have sacrifices? Or maybe you have experiments. Maybe you have a procedure for coping with that lack of knowledge over time. So, maybe we could think of it as a kind of science. Probably one issue with this secular view that we don't need religion or we don't need a big worldview some people have argued that it's led to this meaning crisis, a breakdown in the felt sense that life is worthwhile, which almost everywhere throughout most of history, people have been inducted into a worldview that claims that what they're doing is worth doing. And we don't necessarily have that anymore. And so it's not perhaps surprising that you have rising anxiety, depression, addiction, suicide, and so on. At least that's the claim. And the idea might be that this is linked to education based on print literacy. Clearly, it has very powerful affordances. It's extremely good at empire, for example. You create the law codes in Britain, then you send them out to the empire. That kind of writing is very effective for that sort of thing. In order to, again, to briefly revisit the distinction I'm talking about, the logic of print and the logic of dialogue, shall we say, I'm going to look at the vast contrast there is between good old-fashioned AI, which I started with when I did a PhD in education technology at Open University, around about 1990. Tim O'Shea, who was the head of the lab at that time, had recently written a book on the AI revolution in education. It was all going to be transformed by intelligent tutoring machines. But they were using essentially a print logic. You know, Turing's first computer was written down on paper. It's very much this kind of the idea of meaning as subsumption under a rule. It means something because we can fit it onto a rule. And this is the logic of books and of law codes and so on. And you get it in the Bible, don't you? That it's, and you get it in so on. Actually, do interrupt if you want to challenge or.
Yes.
Okay, jolly good. So then, so you get this kind of teaching machines, which are basically programming people into the correct knowledge. I pulled this off a medical website, but it's basically, and this is sort of how teaching machines tend to work, teach back. So you get the patients to teach back in their own words, and if it doesn't teach back correctly, you kind of, you repeat it with a little bit more adaptively responding to the way they misunderstood it. And that's your basic model of good old-fashioned AI. So what we've got now, generative AI, which really took over, is completely different. It's a completely different way of modeling meaning. If you get inside the machine there with the large language models, there's a lot of fancy stuff going on, but the basis of it is this kind of neural net modeling where you learn meaning of words is not given by, as Bakhtin said, the meaning of a word is not given by the dictionary. It's given by its place in the dialogue, what you're trying to achieve. If somebody raises their eyebrow or something, that means something in the context. In ChatGPT or other large language models are operating on the same basis. Text is broken into these tokens, and then they are integrated into a multi-dimensional schema, which often has many very large numbers of dimensions, and we're talking billions, hundreds of billions of data points. I got this from, you can actually, there's a site where you can look at a high-dimensional space and explore it. I'm not going to go through that with you right now. Just to do a little example, if you just see, the point is that everything means only in relation to other things. So if you just pick on a word there, and I picked on Zen for no reason at all, and you can see it means because of its place in the map, multi-dimensional map, and these are its kind of closest links with different weightings, how close they are. So the artificial intelligence, the generative artificial intelligence, can use this to predict the next word in the sequence. But it's using meaning very much in the way that Bakhtin, the dialogic theorist, used meaning as being something that depends on the context and also depends on the history. So every word changes as its history changes. So I always thought it was a good idea to be pro-life, but it becomes quite controversial in America, doesn't it? Things like that, it changes all the time. Or even, my son using terms like wicked when he was growing up, and I didn't quite understand what he meant. And this is how words really work. I would say that, just to go back to that point I made earlier, it means like a dialogue. And this other kind of meaning is something that was only sort of imposed on the reality of dialogic meaning, and it's rather temporary, and it's reinforced by education. So this is my core argument. What's my core argument? Oh, yes, summarized. Is that basically I'm interested, like a good old-fashioned hippie and what was that conspiracy thing. We want to return to the cave. We've lost the cave. Education is actually about using technology to expand people's consciousness and identity so that they can become part of a larger group and feel at home in that larger group through the process of education and the technology. And that's rather broken down. But is it possible with the new AI-enhanced internet era that we could explore the possibility that we could restore that inner connection of meaning and participation in the group, even without the closure of traditional religious bodies or small-scale communities? Not that they have to be closed, but, they have had that tendency. So just to give a pictorial form, and again, I asked ChatGPT to do this, I had to keep sending it back. It wasn't easy, but the idea is that you start off with people linked through dialogue, linked in an oral community in relationship to each other. you then end up with this rather structured way of thinking, which is very good at commanding a large area. I don't know why I picked on the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, but you could have used Linnaean classification. You could have used any kind of law codes. You have a hierarchy, something at the top, and then you have, all these bishops and priests. And that's fine. It's very good for the power and reach of your organization. But there's a kind of loss of meaning, a loss of context. You can easily creep in if you're not careful. So, again, I asked ChatGPT to draw a picture of the inside of the internet. What? And these are data centers. These are optic cables carrying lots of data. Basically, instead of these previous models, which the trouble with this one is it's a sense of community, but of course, if you're outside the community, you don't really count. Most small-scale societies, their name for themselves is the people, and quite often people outside are not really people, and eland would not speak for you unless you're part of that small group. So the great advantage for me of this print stuff is that it does lead to a global education, and what Oakeshott talked about, the conversation of mankind, where we can learn from China and India and things that have happened. And the print spreads over a large area, but it does so in this rather thin and abstract way. And so the hope is that we could return to a more concrete and inclusive form of identity in the future through the AI-enhanced internet. And I use this phrase AI-enhanced internet because without the internet, you wouldn't get generative AI. It has to trawl the internet and collect hundreds of billions of data points from somewhere. And of course, they're varied and they're mostly from North America at the moment. But the potential is there for creating something rather different for education. So the issue is, can we transform education to focus on the idea of expanding dialogue through a dialogic space using AI? Now, you've got to 3:15 and we want to have questions. So I'll just run through the argument very quickly. At the moment, you'll see AI having two effects. One, it's dumbing students down. If they just, students who use more AI to do their homework will end up with less critical thinking skills. Kind of obvious, isn't it? Because it's like, if instead of carrying boxes around, you use a forklift truck, your muscles don't grow. But why are they doing that? Because they're fitting it into the existing education system. There are lots of other studies that show if you get the AI to challenge them to think and expand their thinking, that can actually get very positive results in terms of their ability to think, as Socrates would have put it, to ask better questions. So the problem here is not about the technology, but it's about the pedagogy, and it's about rethinking what we're doing in education to correspond to the affordances of the AI. Fortunately, as I say, at Cambridge for about 3 decades, we've been developing dialogic education, which is kind of Socratic, in that the aim is to be better at dialogue, better at learning, at listening deeply, at asking better questions. And that's a perfect partner for the AI. And I don't really have time to go into this, but one challenge that's often made, including by a professor of computing at Cambridge, who I will mention, Alan Blackwell. Yeah, I read his recent book, and he said, this is all nonsense because dialogue is about empathy, it's about being human, and AI doesn't have any of that. Well, this very simple model, which I don't know if you've come across, the first chatbot in the 60s, based on kind of Rogerian client-centered counseling. So whatever you threw at it, it would turn it back. So you say, we're not talking about me, we're talking about you. And if you use the word mother, it would say, tell me more about your mother. And he thought this was a proof of artificial stupidity, that of course you could trick people into thinking they were talking to a human when it was really very, very simple code. But what happened was many people spent hours working with it and they found it extremely useful. So dialogue isn't all about empathy. And we showed this with lots of studies of children talking together. Thinking Together program I developed with colleagues, Neil Mercer mainly, and Lynn Dawes. And with all the videos, we could see that they weren't thinking through their massive empathy. So I'm going to have to leap on a bit. That's due to first. So for instance, if somebody challenges you and asks why, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go into great detail. That means you think again, you step up, you reflect. And the AI is very good at doing that by prompting people. What we found, they were kind of moving from, in some cases in the pretest, they were kind of disputing in a way that wasn't really listening, to this idea of creating a shared dialogic space. And that occurred through what I'm calling the mechanism of the witness. But you get this in Buber, you get this in Bakhtin. Whenever you're talking, there's always an outside point of view, a third position that can hear both voices and make sense of it. And you can kind of step up into that, not as a single move, more as what they call in quantum physics a superposition. So you're kind of in both things at once. You're your voice in the dialogue and you're the dialogue. And unless you can shift your identity in that way to be more dialogic, you can't really think. But it's that shift in identity which enables people to fuse horizons, as Gadamer says. It's not about empathy. It's about shifting up to a higher universality that overcomes not only our own particularity, but that of the other. It's, and according to Gilbert Simondon, we won't go into Simondon because it's a bit too complicated, but it's basically this idea of the witness. And I think that's kind of interesting because what you realize is that ultimately, and this is something Buber had already said, dialogue isn't just between two separate positions, me and Beth or something like that. There's also implicit in that very space of meeting or encounter, there's what Buber called the eternal Lao, but there's a dialogue with the outside, which you always get in education as well. And ultimately, it's between the inside that we construct and our situatedness and this outside, and that spark of meaning with the outside is what is motivating genuine thought. It's not just fulfilling some sort of set of algorithmic criteria, and you can generate this in dialogues. And the AI can be a very good partner for that. It can play the role of what George Herbert Mead calls a generalized other. So if it's kind of read everything significant in mathematics, and I know it hasn't got through the paywalls yet, but we're working on that. We're going to break down these individual property rights and share everything. And then when it can represent mathematics or it can represent history, it can act as a partner. And then the children, if they're students, if they've had this dialogic education, can leapfrog that and go further and ask further questions. So this has this potential, the dialogue with the AI, plus the ability to ask questions and dialogue with it, has this potential to take students further into a more collective identity that can go beyond the local differences that we see. Of course, now, I thought I'd better put in at this point, the critical thing is not nonsense. It's obviously rather scary. I was horrified that Elon Musk could go in and influence Grok and tell it to change what they're saying about some nonsense about South Africa, and that's shocking, isn't it? So if we come to rely on the AI as a kind of big other, and then people can control it, this is quite dangerous. But I think it's something that we have to address, and we shouldn't allow this power to be in the hands of capitalist industries. I don't think it should be beyond the wit of humans to somehow create a collective educational AI, rather like Generation Global, which I worked with Ian Jameson. I don't know if you know Ian Jameson. And there's another one called Empathic, I think, for primary kids. So there are lots of these global networks. So if we had some philanthropy or UNESCO behind us, I think we need to get a control of this because it's so powerful. But I think that's actually similar in terms of religious education to the issue of idolatry, which you get in most religions, the confusion between your own construction and the infinite and unknowable that you're trying to relate to. And it's kind of the same with AI, isn't it? It's always possible that someone will capture and control this, but the best defense against that is teaching people to think and ask questions and not just accept what they're given and take it further. Anyway, I think I better move on a bit faster. So I personally, what I didn't like about RE is that when I taught it, they turned it into a kind of history lesson, so I could teach about, what the Sikhs had to wear and the dagger, and everyone loved that. But it wasn't enough because it wasn't teaching about something that could give you meaning. And I just wonder, I would like to propose that this dialogic approach brings with it an ethics and a value and potentially a meaning. And there's a certain faith involved in believing that stuff has meaning and is worth doing, and you're going to make sense of things, and that we are actually learning, and that given that we're part of a larger, complexly integrated system, it's precisely because we can only know from our worldview And as long as that worldview is engaged, there's not a limit. That's our ability to engage with the world at all. It's a bit like saying that having an eye doesn't stop us, doesn't limit us, it enables us. Having a language doesn't limit us, it enables us to see further. But we need to teach the essential virtues of epistemological humility and the virtues that relate to effective dialogue. So I'm trying to propose that given the problems of given the huge benefits of religion, proven benefits for mental health, for community, it's a shame to let all that disappear. Can we reintroduce that without losing it, building on those traditions, with this focus on a dialogue between traditions, between worldview, which carries with it its own kind of faith, and it's a faith in this dialogue with the infinite horizon, which is in a way your essential identity, given that you're part of something much bigger than yourself that you don't understand. And you can bring in these essential virtues, which we ought to actively teach, including, of course, the courage to speak up when you disagree with stuff, and resilience, and empathy and honesty, especially the honesty of actually accepting counterclaims. So that's my attempt. I won't say too much because we definitely need some questions now. But that's why what we're doing at the moment, we're developing AI tutors to teach dialogue, also to moderate groups, and we're getting very positive results so far. So the idea, I think this is, hopefully, this is my last page. So, this is also just a proposal that I put in a blog earlier in response to a challenge to RE from the, Skeptics Society saying it's a waste of time to get rid of it. I was saying, why don't we reinvent it as a global dialogue with a moderated site supported by AI, where everybody explores the question, what gives meaning for you? That was the bit I liked about RE. We had interesting conversations. We went to different faith centers and we talked to people. Why can't we do that globally and explore together? What gives people's lives meaning? And maybe collectively we come up with some sort of shared framework which involves respect for the multiple pathways. And I think this is very much in the spirit of the Sea of Faiths. So I'll end there with these 2 recent books. And also, I just started a recent blog. So do have a look at my Substack, which you can get through that. Thank you. Oh, I apologize for rushing a bit at the end. I did sort of plan for an hour, so I don't think I was completely out, but we want more time for questions, don't we? Because I think you got the main point.
20 minutes question. Yeah, that's good, isn't it? That's not bad. Oh, can I sit down? The question I said, shoot. What was this? What? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting. I'm afraid I think I'm mostly in the position of the naysayer for this conference. And that's not something I'm 100% comfortable with, but I want to push back on 2 things specifically that you mentioned. The first, and is the first premise of your talk, is that based on the benchmark material, AI is at least as smart as us, if not smarter, on those specific tests. And the problem is partially with who's telling us that it is this smart, that there is meant to be in the training and testing of these models a separation between the material that's used to train them and the material that's used to test them. It's called the train test split paradigm. And unfortunately, in the case of OpenAI, they will not release their training data. So we don't know if what happens in these benchmarking tests is actually just recitation of the material that the models are being trained on. So my first quick question on that is, if that data is in fact wrong, does it break down the rest of your premise that AI is as good as smart as us? And the second bit I just quickly wanted to push back on. Later, you mentioned the idea of sort of more decentralized artificial intelligence away from corporations. Now, the kinds of examples you would give would probably be API based, that they are actually built upon the models that are being developed by companies like OpenAI, because the generation of these models is extremely expensive. And we were talking about the size of servers that are required for training these models, and the time and the resources and the money. So actually, the decentralization is still based upon the corporate interests that we've criticized as well. So I just wondered if you had a response to those 2 things, that the problem of your original premise might be incorrect, and this idea of decentralizing and democratizing AI.
Well,
obviously I got this from Teddy Teaser, it's a bit of a risk. But I think, that actually there's lots of evidence out there. Right? They come up with new things every year and headlines and so on. And particularly in America, because in America, they're very keen on these multiple choice tests.
She's down my right.
Oh, sorry.
Back.
Oh, okay. Apologize. Thank you. Yeah, in America, they do all these multiple choice tests, and that's where it's particularly effective. Apparently, that's a very high score on its stat reading and writing, up there in the top quartile. And the 5 out of 5 on advanced placement in biology, these aren't things that the AI can take according to your training data.
The training data is literally those tests. It will just regurgitate the tests that's been trained on. That's what I'm saying. You have to something specifically different. We're never having access to the training data. So if you put in the AQ biology test of the previous year and then you ask it the question through the test of the previous year, it may just be regurgitated.
Oh, yes. So that
was that from Jesus or radio? He says here.
Because each year it's resets, right? There's different questions on the same original knowledge that the test is built on. But it's not literally last year's question because they did time last year.
Well, I think that's very interesting, and I should certainly look into it. This was a study published recently where they got AI without that just to do a psychology exam. People couldn't tell the difference between the AI and the students. It didn't do better than the best students, but it did better than most of them. And there are lots of studies like this. If you follow the data, if you follow the news items, it keeps coming out with more.
That teaches from OpenAI. Detection of AI-generated essays is incredibly inaccurate. I just recently did this on those AI professors I was talking about. Some tests were saying you're quite more through.
No, they're not detecting it. They were using an AI to pretend to be a student, and the teachers didn't detect it, and the teachers gave them higher mark than the students. And I know from my experience, because I work with a lot of essays and so on, the AI is pretty good at these essays. It might not be as good as the best students, but it can certainly write pretty good essays. And I know because I'm writing half my stuff in it, as you can see.
Edge is different than humans reading essays in society. They sound like AI humans.
Yeah, but given that it's been around for 2 years and it's improving rapidly, I think we can safely say that, and given that there are other tests like with the doctors diagnosing patients and these sort of things, there are many areas in which AI is doing as well as or much better at the assessments, and this is only going to improve because there's this learning curve. And secondly, let's go back to your other. I think you're picking holes in something. Aren't you impressed that it can do so well at so many tests? I think it's extraordinary. I was really amazed by it. Of course, you're talking about decentralized AI. I wasn't suggesting there was, but of course, there's DeepSeek. As I understand it, DeepSeek is much more transparent and available.
It's shiny, so there isn't a few around transparency is.
Well, I'm incredibly glad that Californian capitalism has a counter model. You'll also notice that TikTok in China has a lot of educational contents and a lot of moderation. I think we've discovered here the problem with social media isn't the technology. On the whole, the technology just wants to connect everyone with everyone and everywhere with everywhere. It's the capitalists who are intervening with their algorithms to make profit.
She doesn't want to do anything, let's be accurate. The technology doesn't.
Who does want anything then? Because this is probably the crux of my argument, and what is a human? Where do humans come from? Why do you want stuff?
we're going to have a go plenary.
Well, that is actually, I wanted to come into this because obviously what I'm arguing here is a post-humanist perspective, which is much closer to animism, which doesn't pretend that humans are some sort of separate category from the universe that gives value to everything. It recognizes that the universe has meaning because we have meaning and we are natural beings within the universe. The reason I like strawberries or I want sex or I'm looking for the meaning of life isn't because of me. It's because I'm part of a much bigger cosmos, which is very complex. The one thing we are learning from quantum theory and from our best physics is that there is no separate little atom or separate little self, that there are these emergence within complex adaptive systems where some people would argue all you have are processes and emergence. So animism is real, and that kind of means that the question of does AI think, do humans think, is a little bit irrelevant, because what we have are thinking only ever occurs in dialogues and networks, and what we have are evolving and emergent organisms and dialogues, and that's why people can be bigger than themselves.
That's why we can go beyond this little bourgeois world where everyone owns their own ideas and sells them on the market, why we can move forward to a future potential, which rather as the Chinese advocate, you actually have a collective and inclusive thinking, and the AI can support us in that next stage of collective intelligence, and education should be serving as the midwife to this natural process, which is bigger than us, which was prefigured by great thinkers like Teilhard de Chardin, but which we can see everywhere. Technology does think. Nature does think. The universe has meaning, and our job isn't to force our own little meanings on the world. It's to listen and learn to discern the good voices from the bad and take them forward. Gosh, I'm really preaching there. You've encouraged me. But that's why I like RE and religion, because I think what we're all doing should be to connect to the cosmos, and ultimately education and even science is a spiritual discipline. It's about listening to the cosmos and not just inducting people into their place in their little local community. It's teaching them how to be cosmopolitan citizens of the cosmos. That's what education is for, especially science education. And that's why RE has a point, and we could return to the kind of education which would give people meaning, instead of teaching them that those experts with PhDs, they control the meaning and we don't understand anything and we just have to listen to them. Everybody could recognize that at their heart, they are the cosmos. They're the cosmos looking back at itself, as Carl Sagan said.
Well, let's go to that. You.
No, that's why I'm preaching. I'm here with the pulpit. You don't have to think that. I'm just putting that out there.
Question of that.
Okay. Sorry. Hello, Professor Rupert. I have a question. So I think this is really good for us to discuss about where should education head to in the AI era. I'm wondering, do you have already got some kind of model in shaping, or are we still in the dialogue to shape it? Because I think the current model won't last too long.
No, well, that's why we set up the Digital Education Futures Initiative at Cambridge to explore new models. And of course, obviously one has to be pragmatic, and it looks like it's quite disruptive, but that doesn't usually work. So one school I've noticed in Texas, which is extremely interesting, is a kind of hybrid model where in the morning they spend 2 hours. It's called the Alpha School. You can look it up. They spend 2 hours with adaptive AI systems to do the kind of traditional curriculum, to learn about history, maths, and so on. Afternoon, passion projects, enterprise, working with AI to support them in developing those kind of, advanced competencies and creativity and so on. That seems to me a very exciting model. What we're also working on, following Generation Global, is online networks where young people from different countries could focus on future challenges, not on learning just what we've known in the past, but on how can we solve future challenges, working with AI and interdisciplinary studies. So but the thing is, what humans do, what the AI can't do, is they care about stuff. So we could develop and promote that. And so it's, in a way, teaching leadership, giving life meaning. And then AI is always your assistant. You're not enthralled to it, because if you just fit in the existing system where you have this exam with all these right answers and these essay marks, and you're inevitably using AI in a way that subordinates you to it, because it becomes the expert. If you have your own project, then it's an assistant to help you with that. And that's how the education world should shift towards promoting that kind of agency. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Could we kind of perhaps come back down to earth from the cosmos reflecting upon itself to a classroom I'm about to teach in tomorrow? I'm not, thank goodness, but how we can give us a practical example of how we can use AI to facilitate dialogue in our classrooms.
Yeah, that's always the killer question, isn't there? That's why I left teaching for research. What I like doing, I like solving all the world's problems just in an essay. And then, unfortunately, it's much harder in teaching, isn't it? But there are quite a few interesting studies. There was one from another Austin, Texas, again, where they were using the AI to actually mediated by teachers. So they're getting the students to work in groups on problems, and then The teachers were mediating prompts and extensions with the AI. They got very good results for this. So how I would use AI, both as an individual and as a group, is to challenge your assumptions. So put them in groups, working on a problem, and work it through with the AI. And have the AI, for example, we have some complicated prompt developed by my friend Simon Buckingham-Shum called Question Reframer, which you can look at on ChatGPT. Whatever question you give to it, it does a Socrates and unpacks the assumptions, and you can explore the assumptions. They're using this in the University of Technology in Sydney, and it seems to be useful. It's useful. There are lots of techniques you could use, but it's useful as a way of getting people to help them reframe and rethink their problems. I find whatever I put to it, it does actually know quite a lot, despite the paywalls, which we will get rid of. It enables you to explore the range of perspectives that are similar to your area. So I've discovered people doing work like mine in different areas, but the students can do the same. They could look at what are the range of perspectives. Another activity which is quite good, which was mentioned, I think, earlier, is you create a lot of role play. So you could have a dialogue between different figures. You could have a dialogue between, I don't know, Galileo and the Pope. Oh, that was that dialogue I put up there. Galileo and Einstein or whatever. So, and that's quite an exciting activity to basically what I think you should do is open up a dialogic space, widen that by bringing in more perspectives, deepen it by questioning the assumptions, and rethink your questions. And you can do that in any subject area, I think, don't you? So with your what was the big issues, big ideas? You could use that as one of the activities early on to explore it and widen it up. That's what I'd suggest.
Okay, so I enjoyed your talk very much. Very presented with great panache and hyperbole. Now, firstly, I'd just like you to send me the reference for patients preferring AI to doctors. That is what you said.
Yes.
I agree that AI is better than doctors at certain cherry-picked tasks, but the preference I would like the reference for. Also the reference for the huge benefits of religion. Okay, huge benefits. I mean, there are some modest benefits in some countries, but if you could send me the reference for that. And the only other thing I'd like to say is that you said at one stage that you felt that science, secular science, was a form of religion. Well, I mean, obviously, if you want to include non-religious things in the word religion, then I can see that. But most people consider that the definition of religion is probably based best on a Wittgenstein family resemblance, including belief in gods and afterlife, the supernatural, sacred texts, sacred objects, prescribed liturgies, and so on, which science has none of. So do you really believe that science is a religion?
Well, the logic there, it's the logic of this worldview stuff that we is part of this community, I believe. So if you study if you study social anthropology, slightly traditional model, I suppose, where you have these small scale indigenous groups, you will look at what they think is important, what they're living for, their rituals, their beliefs, their practices. And you'll say that's their religion, right? But actually, they might not see it that way. They might just see this is the way things are. We sacrifice children to the god because that helps the sunrise. That's just the way it is. Now, if you come then to our culture, I feel legitimate in saying that scientists might not think what they're doing is religion, but that's why I brought in, and this is, of course, a bit of a problem, but it's quite possible for people to be performing the function of a religion without realizing it. That's what you learn from social anthropology. Now, if we accept this rather crude version of defining religion as how we relate to the great unknown, science is precisely that. Some people would see it as a kind of radicalization of the Protestant critique of Catholicism. Why does it only occur here? It finds faith and meaning. It actually thinks that if we explore different parts of the universe, it's going to make sense. And that's worth doing. And why is it worth doing? Because, things all out of make sense. And the important thing is this open-minded inquiry, which is how we relate to and manage the uncertainty and the chaos. So it's a particular interpretation which might not be agreed by all, but I don't think it's entirely implausible to suggest that science, for some people, could be a religion. And actually what I'm kind of advocating is that we ramp it up a bit, that we don't treat it as if it's somehow a meaningless process, but we actually, why don't we teach it as a religion? Why don't we? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's say the cosmos has some sort of meaning and science is trying to figure out what that meaning is. Well, do you have meaning?
I value a sense of being full.
Oh, but you
The sense of needing a sense of agency. So we finally use something. This is then this revolves. We tend to look for me, even as it.
right. We say that. What would the yeah? You so the
Activity is why we realize nothing.
hang on a minute. You've evolved to experience meaning, right? So who's the
needs
who? No. Oh, but have you not evolved? Don't you actually recognize, for instance, if you're not too intellectual about it, that a sunny day seems to feel like more meaningful than a miserable rainy day? Is that not part of your evolution? Or that nice food motivates you? I mean, why are you trying to do what you're doing in life? Where does it come from?
I think some of us make me rather than look for me.
Well, I think people have always had that claim since humanists came in, but I'm looking for the evidence.
We wanted to diversify in the sources here. Be five noise.
Look, well, I mean, there are a number of people, Sidalski is one of them, who argue that actually the evidence is pretty massive, that most people do what they're kind of programmed to do biologically and culturally and socially. Afterwards, they are kind of taught to accept moral responsibility and say, no, that was my meaning, that was my property, that's my idea. Not really. We're part of a much larger system in which we do what we're programmed to do. Now, either we have faith that that has some sort of meaning, or we're kind of miserable. But to claim that we impose that meaning, I think that's delusional, frankly. I think it's idolatry. I think we've set up little individual gods as gods against the cosmos. And I think we'd all be a lot happier if, in the words of Islam, we surrendered to recognize that we're part of something bigger that gives us meaning.
Do me one more question, boy.
I don't find it very useful at all to talk about meaning. I find it more useful to talk about meanings. I appreciate that we're all part of the same cosmos, you and I, but when you look at meaning of the cosmos, you look at it from your scientific perspective. I look at it probably from more of a philosophical perspective, and I suggest that my meaning, whatever it may be, or meanings, I prefer to say, would be very different to yours. So I don't find it useful at all to talk about this big, heavy word, meaning. Life is full of meanings.
Well, I respectfully disagree. I think the whole point of philosophy and theology, I remember I actually had this, the reason I went out of theology at Kent, we had this very modular degree, and Rabbi Cohen, I remember, when I pointed out that I was trying to find the meaning of meaning, he kind of scoffed and was very supercilious, oh, meaning of meaning, But actually, it's not that difficult. By looking into it, it's chapter 7 of my book, Theory of Education Technology, you'd be interested. You can actually understand where meaning comes from in the cosmos. And it isn't just human. You'll be interested to know that bacteria have a moral code. They gang together and they punish other bacteria that don't contribute. Meaning is actually part of self-reproducing loops, and we don't find meaning within individual humans. We find meaning in the dialogues and the loops that they participate in. And in education, we are not doing children a service by claiming that they've got to find meaning for themselves and create meaning for themselves. This is what makes everybody so despairing and miserable. We have to induct them into these larger loops of meaning that connect them to history, that connect them to others in their community, and that connect them to the cosmos. And this is what religion evolved to do, and it did very successfully. And I can give you this gentleman the evidence that he needs. There's pretty good evidence on all sorts of factors. And I think we shouldn't just accept this individualism is a cul-de-sac that's leading to suicidalism. I think we need to find a way to return to connect children through education into much larger circuits that give them meaning. And that's what I discovered in my life. This is why I came into RE in education. As a young person, I wasn't the only one wandering around struggling to find meaning. Many of my colleagues seem to be thinking about suicide, committing suicide, taking drugs, all the rest of it. It's only when I died to myself and I discovered that I was not who I thought I was, but that I was part of the cosmos. I didn't become a Christian, but I recognized the meaning of the language, because that is the reality of our situation. It's a superposition. We are not separate, isolated atoms. We are part of the cosmos. If you look into your heart, you don't find a separate person. You find the cosmos. And we need to educate people to have that experience, that essentially mystical experience, which gives them meaning, just as people have been educated throughout thousands of years. And we're failing children when we fail to do that, because a few of us can manage to survive without that. I think it's important.
While it's time to say in, I can say we're warming up for good